sharing my carriage. Were any of these, I wondered, potential patients of mine? Did they have any idea how much I wanted them to stay well and healthy? A large, red-faced man, wearing a brownish tweed jacket, old-fashioned gaiters, and a pair of heavy brown boots, suddenly belched, temporarily interrupting his steady snoring to do so. A young woman wearing a dark blue overcoat and a small blue felt hat looked across at him, sniffed and tutted, and then looked away. She clasped her gloved hands neatly in her lap and stared out of the window. She was in her late 20s or early 30s, but her clothes made her look much older. A young woman in her early 20s loudly shushed the two boys who were travelling with her. I suppose they were her sons. They seemed to find great humour in the sounds emanating from the fat man's body, and had to struggle to contain their amusement. A man in a grey suit buried himself in his morning newspaper. An elderly woman wearing a black dress, black coat, black hat and black shoes glowered around at all of us, as though holding us all responsible for failing to protect her from these social insults, before folding her arms across her chest, as though defiantly barricading herself against our world. The train, slowing down, started to follow a long, gentle curve to the left. Looking out of the window, I saw a sign on the platform which told me that we had arrived at the end of the line. Barnstaple. This was it. Grown-up reality, responsibility, and heaven knows what else lay just a few miles away from here. My mouth felt dry, and I could feel a squadron of butterflies becoming airborne in my stomach. Politely, I waited until the other passengers had left the train, and then picked up my black leather doctor's bag and my cheap but capacious blue cardboard suitcase, and shuffled along the corridor. I was clambering down onto the platform when I realised that something had happened a few yards in front of me, halfway between the train door and the exit from the platform. As I got closer to the crowd which had formed, I realised that the fat man in the tweed suit, gaiters and heavy brown boots was the centre of attraction. He was lying flat on his back on the platform, and even from a distance it was clear to a trained medical mind that all was not well. "Excuse me," I heard myself saying, as I gently squeezed my way through between a tall, thin man in a brown trilby and the elderly woman dressed all in black. I dropped my suitcase outside the circle, but kept a tight hold on my doctor's bag. It contained the instruments of my profession, and without it, I would have felt as vulnerable and as useless as a gunfighter entering the OK Corral without his pistols. "I'm a doctor," I explained diffidently, hoping that this confession would excuse my behaviour, but not attract too much attention. I had spoken quietly, but the response was as immediate and as dramatic as if I'd shouted the words at the top of my voice. These magic words, "I'm a doctor," would, I was to discover in the fullness of time, part any crowd. The circle widened, and I was aware of every eye being trained on me. Every eye except two, that is. The exceptions belonged to the young woman in the blue woolen coat and the blue felt hat, who had sat across the aisle from me on the train. She was stooping beside the prostrate fat man in the tweed suit, having unbuttoned her coat to make kneeling easier. "Give me a hand," she said, without looking up, but moving round so that she was behind the man's head. She nodded towards his feet. I put down my black bag. "Is he all right?" I asked hesitantly. "Shouldn't we do a few tests before we move him? He might have damaged his spine." "He's drunk," said the woman in the blue coat firmly. As though anxious to confirm her diagnosis, the fat man suddenly sat up. He opened his eyes and looked around him, lifted one hand, as though he wanted to make a gesture of some kind, and then collapsed flat on his back again with a loud burp. I found myself engulfed in a suffocating cloud of stale beer. The woman in the blue coat sighed wearily, as though none of this was new to her. "Let's get him into a taxi." She lifted his head and shoulders, and I lifted his feet, and together we carried him out to the station forecourt. There were half